when a whale sank their boat. When they heard a bang, a crew member then saw a whale gushing blood,
destroying the rudder, piercing the hull, water rushing on board.
Turned into a horrifying fight for survival.
The cause of the capsizing is presently under investigation.
Suddenly getting attacked by a whale.
sank 15 minutes after being hit by the whale.
There's no clear answer, but many believe the behavior is learned.
The story of Moby Dick is a classic story written in 1851. Its main stars are Moby Dick and Captain Ahab, whose leg was bitten off by Moby Dick on a previous voyage. This story is about a whaling ship that gets attacked by a whale. A chase over multiple days occurs. Moby Dick bites the boat in half, tossing the crew and Ahab into the waters, wreaking havoc over the men trying to harpoon him. The men are killed by the whale, except for Ishmael, who is unable to return to the harpoon boat, stranded at sea, and ultimately survived the final attack from Moby Dick. One would think this is a made-up story, a fantasy made up with no truth to the story, but that is not the case. The ending is based on the sinking of the Essex. The Essex was built in Amesbury, Massachusetts in 1799. She was made from white oak, known for its strength. She was 238 tons, 87 foot 7 inches long, and had a 24-foot beam and a 12-foot 6-inch depth. She carried 4 whaleboats between 20 to 30 feet long, with one more as a spare in the hold. She was launched in 1799 as a merchant ship, but was converted to a whaling ship later in life. She was based in Nantucket, the whaling capital of the United States. Whaling dates back to as far as 3000 BC, but as an organized industry as early as 1875 AD. The U.S. began whaling in the late colonial period in New York and New England. Whale oil was in high demand to fuel lamps. The oil made from the whales was used to fuel streetlights, oil lamps, on ships and in homes. Oil lamps were used as the main source of light in the 17th, 18th, and early 1900s. The U.S. became the most prominent whaling nation by the 1830s. Whaling voyages could last for multiple years away at sea. After the whales were harvested close to home, they had to travel as far as the South Pacific to find the whales, eventually traveling farther and farther to find the whales, until the use of kerosene took over from whale oil. Whaling was an extremely dangerous and dirty, difficult profession. After a whale was spotted, the whaleboats, about 25 feet long, were loaded with crews with harpoons. The more nimble boats were maneuvered towards the giant whales. A rope connected to the harpoon was thrown. They waited until the whale tired. They went in close and finished the hunt, and then they towed it back to the main ship and harvested for the blubber and oil. By the time the Essex went off on her final voyage, she was 20 years old. She had been very profitable in previous years, giving her the reputation of being a lucky ship. The captain, George Pollard Jr., was 29, and he was one of the youngest men ever to capture a whaling ship. First mate Owen Chase, 23, had served with Pollard on the ship's previous voyage. A successful voyage which led to their promotions. Thomas Nickerson, who was the youngest crew member at 14, he served as a cabin boy. The other sailors on board were William Bond, Samuel Reed, Richard Peterson, Henry DeWitt, Lawson Thomas, Charles Shorter, Isaiah Shepard, Seth Weeks, Joseph West, William Wright, Isaac Cole, Thomas Chappell, Matthew Joy, Barzillai Ray, Charles Ramsdale, Benjamin Lawrence, Obed Hicks, and Owen Coffin. There were 21 crew members in total. They expected the journey to last 2.5 years to the whaling grounds on the west coast of South America. They loaded the ship with provisions and set off from Nantucket on August 12, 1819. 2 days after their departure, they hit a squall. She almost sank. She was knocked on her beam ends, lost her top gallant sail, and 2 whaleboats were destroyed, and another one damaged. Captain Pollard decided to continue the voyage, without returning to replace or repair the destroyed and broken whaling boats. The Essex reached and rounded Cape Horn in January 1820, which was a very slow journey for even the time. The crew spoke of these ill omens, but were later content once they reached the hunting grounds. They traveled to the South Pacific up to the Atacames, present-day Ecuador. The crew had divided into 3 groups. 6 men on each of the 3 remaining whale ships would go out if a whale was spotted. The rest of the men would stay on board the Essex. The 3 whaling boats were led by 3 officers, one by Captain Pollard, one by First Mate Chase, and the last by Second Mate Joy. In September 1820, sailor Henry DeWitt deserted the ship at Atacames, bringing the crew total to 20 men. This was commonplace during the time. The ships always had desertions, but this was bad for the small crew. Each whaling boat needed 6 men to run it. Now with 20 sailors, it only left 2 men aboard the Essex during a hunt, which made it unsafe for the ship of that size. She had 3 masts and was 87 feet long after all. After this disaster, bad luck continued for the crew. The population of whales in this area had been exhausted. They met another ship of whalers in the area who told them of a new hunting ground called the Offshore Ground. Its location was 5 and 10 degrees south latitude between 105 and 125 degrees west longitude, 2,500 miles to the southwest, a very long distance from any known land the crew was familiar with. The crew had also heard of cannibalistic islands in the area of the South Pacific. The Essex sailed for the Galapagos Islands, specifically the island now known as Florina Island. They needed to restock their supplies, which had been dwindling from their failure along the coast of South America. The Essex sprung a large leak, so they anchored off current Hispaniola Island October 8, 1820 to fix it. They were anchored about a week. During this time, they caught 300 Galapagos giant tortoises, weighing between 100 and 800 pounds each, to resupply their food stores. They sailed again for current-day Florina Island. On October 22nd, they caught another 60 tortoises. They let some of them roam around the ship to keep the meat from spoiling. Once they reached Florina Island, the crew went on a hunt to catch more food. It was the dry season. The brush was very dry, and it hadn't rained in a while. Helmsman Thomas Chappell decided he would play a prank on his fellow crew members, and he set a fire. The fire immediately burned out of control, surrounding the crew, forcing them to all bolt back for the Essex to escape the flames from burning them alive. Once they arrived back at the ship, the entire island was almost ablaze. Captain Pollard was enraged and wanted vengeance on whoever set the fire. Chappell feared being whipped and did not confess immediately. It wasn't until much later when he admitted his prank that went horribly wrong. The Essex set sail the next day, with the island still burning in the distance. The day after, smoke and fire were still visible on the horizon. Many years later, Nickerson, a survivor of the voyage, returned to the island, and he found blackened and charred wasteland. There were no trees, shrubbery, or grass left. It is believed that the fire was one of the main reasons for the near extinction of the Florina land tortoise and the Florina mockingbird, which no longer inhabit the island. The Essex finally reached the new whaling grounds. The officers of the Essex had heated arguments after days of not sighting any whales, thinking that they had been duped. Until November 16th, they spotted their first whale. It surfaced directly under Chase's whaling boat, dashing it to pieces. 4 days later, the lookout spotted a spout of water from a whale's blowhole. They raced to get the 3 remaining whaleboats ready, grabbed the harpoons and lances, and sailed away from the Essex towards the pod of sperm whales. Chase's boat successfully harpooned a whale, but the whale's tail smashed into the boat, opening up a seam and flooding water into the boat. They had to cut the harpoon line and return to the Essex for repairs. 2 miles away, Joy and Pollard's boats were both harpooning a whale, and the whale sped off away from the Essex, dragging the 2 boats with it. This act of being dragged around by a whale was nicknamed a Nantucket sleigh ride. Chase began repairs on his whaling boat after the failure of the first hunt, when the crew spotted a gigantic bull sperm whale, a very large 85-foot male whale. The maximum size for a large bull was around 65 feet, but this was a massive whale, some 20 feet longer than the crew had seen before, just under the length of their entire ship. The crew spotted it just floating on the surface, acting very strangely, not moving, but just facing the Essex. Then it suddenly began heading towards the Essex, picking up speed by diving and returning to the surface. The whale rammed into the side of the Essex, knocking her from side to side. The large whale then dove under the ship. He surfaced again on the Essex starboard side. His large head in line with Essex's bow, motionless, he appeared stunned from the impact with the ship. His tail at the stern, the same size as the large ship. Chase ran and got a harpoon. He was getting prepared to harpoon the giant beast when he noticed the tail was just inches from the rudder. If he were to harpoon the whale, his tail could smash into the rudder and completely incapacitate the Essex. She was thousands of miles from land. He hesitated and contemplated whether to risk it and go in for the kill. During this conundrum, the large bull recovered enough to swim off, and he swam a few hundred yards away. It turned to face the bow of the ship. Chase gave this testimony. I turned and saw him about 100 rods directly ahead of us, 550 yards, coming down with twice his ordinary speed of around 24 knots, and it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The surf flew in all directions about him with the continual violent thrashing of his tail. His head about half out of the water, and in that way he came upon us, and again struck the ship. The whale rammed into the bow, crushing it. The ship was pushed backwards. After this, he finally removed his head from the broken timbers of the ship and swam away. They never saw the whale again. The Essex began sinking quickly bow first. The sailors quickly tried to add rigging to one of the remaining whaling boats that was left on board before she sank. The last minutes, William Bond, the ship's steward, frantically ran below deck and grabbed the captain's sea chest and any navigational equipment he could find. Owen Chase, first mate, wrote this about the incident. The captain's boat was the first that reached us. He stopped about a boat's length off, but had no power to utter a single syllable. He was so completely overpowered with the spectacle before him. He was in short time, however, enabled to address the inquiry to me. "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" I answered. "We have been stove by a whale." No one knows the cause of the whale's aggression. In the book In the Heart of the Sea, written by Nathaniel Philbrick, he speculated that it might have accidentally struck the boat on the first hit, or it might have had its curiosity aroused by the hammering on board while they were doing repairs to the whaleboat. The frequency of the hammer hitting the nail might have sounded similar to those made by a bull sperm whale to communicate and echolocate. But in the end, we have no idea what caused the whale to act this way and attack the ship. The Essex was around 2,000 nautical miles west of South America. The crew spent 2 days salvaging what they could from the wreck of the Essex. The sailors had the 3 whaling boats left, each between 20 and 30 feet long, and 20 sailors in total. The men were divided between them. Captain Pollard chose 6 Nantucket sailors, including Owen Coffin, his teenage cousin. First Mate Chase chose the remaining white sailors, and Second Mate Joy had the African-American sailors on his boat. The men prepared to set off, quite aware that their food supplies and fresh water were extremely inadequate for a journey to land. The crew built masts and sails for the small whaling boats, which they salvaged from the Essex. The gunwales were low on the small boats, so the men salvaged boards and added them to the gunwales to prevent waves from entering in the boat. Inside the captain's sea chest, which William Bond grabbed right before the ship sank, was 2 sets of naval equipment and 2 copies of maritime charts. They split these between Captain Pollard's and First Mate Chase's boat. Second Mate Joy's boat was left without the ability to navigate, so it was extremely important that they kept in sight of the other boats. The officer studied the maritime charts and decided the closest islands were the Marquesas, 1,200 miles to the west, and Captain Pollard was intent on heading for them. But the crew voiced their opposition, and they were led by First Mate Chase. They told their fears that the islands might have cannibals, and they wanted to head east instead for South America. The trade winds were against them, so they would have to sail south 1,000 miles first, then travel 3,000 miles to the east to South America. Even though this trip would take 3 times longer, Captain Pollard agreed to the crew's route because of their fears about cannibalism on the islands. Thomas Nickerson wrote later in life, "Not wishing to oppose, where there was 2 against 1, the captain reluctantly agreed to their arguments. A fatal error. How many warm hearts have ceased to beat in consequence of it?" Thomas Nickerson, cabin boy. The horrible irony of this decision would later become apparent for the men. All their food and water was rationed from the start of their journey. Unfortunately, most of the food was soaked in salt water, and eating this increased their thirst greatly. Their food was mainly hardtack, a dense biscuit made from flour and water. It could last for years if kept dry, but it was soaked in the salt water. It took them 2 weeks to eat the tainted food. They kept rinsing their mouths out with salt water to quell their thirst, and they began drinking their urine. They managed to bring a few giant Galapagos tortoises that they had captured with them, but because of their immense size, they could only bring a few. They had to let the others go. Their whaling boats were not built with the intention of sailing long distances, and the repairs they made were minimal. The boats had constant leaks, which plagued the crew during the whole voyage. They managed to catch rainwater in the sails, but the sails were soaked in salt from the seawater, and it tainted the rainwater that they caught. The sun beat down on the men, and they were unable to catch any fish. One of the boats lost a plank of wood on the side of the boat, so the men had to move to the other side to raise it out of the water. And another boat came up next to the leaning boat and nailed a new board upon. The patch worked, but the boats leaked horribly. Storms and rough seas battered the boats frequently. Their time was spent steering and trimming the boats, as well as bailing the water from the bilge. After a month at sea in the tiny boats, they were almost out of provisions, when on December 20th, land was spotted on the horizon. They landed on the uninhabited Henderson Island, a small uplifted coral atoll in modern-day British territory in the Pitcairn Islands. The sailors believed they were at Ducie Island, a similar-looking island 220 miles to the east. But if they had landed on Pitcairn Island itself 120 miles to the southwest, they might have received help. The descendants of the survivors of the HMS Bounty, who mutinied in 1789, still lived on the island. Luckily, once they landed on the island, they found a small freshwater spring below the tide line. This is lucky because the men could have been within hours of dying from thirst. The men found endemic birds, crabs, eggs, and peppergrass to eat. Thomas Nickerson wrote this: "Here everyone seated themselves upon the grass, and perhaps no banquet was ever enjoyed with greater gusto or gave such universal satisfaction." After 1 week, they had consumed almost the entire island's food sources. Until December 26, most of the sailors concluded that they would starve if they stayed on the island any longer. The crew prepared to set sail in the whaleboats, but 3 men, William Wright, Seth Weeks, and Thomas Chappell, decided to stay behind on the island. Captain Pollard promised to send a ship if any of them survived. December 27th, the sailors filled their water casks and brought some fish, crabs, and birds that they had caught from the island and boarded the boats. Their number was now 17. They aimed for Easter Island. After only 3 days, they had consumed all of the food that they had brought from the island. They only had a small amount of hardtack left from the Essex. On January 4th, 1821, they estimated that they had drifted too far south to make for Easter Island, so they now intended to make their new destination Masatira Island, 1,818 miles to the east, 419 miles from South America. Second mate Matthew Joy, who had been in poor health since the onset of the voyage in Nantucket, was dying. He got increasingly worse. He asked Captain Pollard if he could stay on his boat until his death. On January 10th, Joy became the first crew member to die. He was sewn into his clothes and buried at sea. From then on, the men began to die one by one. Obed Hendricks assumed leadership on Joy's boat. On January 11th, First Mate Chase's boat, which also held Richard Peterson, Isaac Cole, Benjamin Lawrence, and Thomas Nickerson, became lost from the other 2 boats. During an intense squall, Richard Peterson lost the will to live, and he died on January 18th. He was buried at sea the same way. Isaac Cole died February 8th, but with their food stores running extremely low, the crew saved his body. After a discussion, the men decided to engage in the last resort. They had turned to cannibalism, the very thing they were so scared of, which made them go 4,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean instead of sailing just 1,200 miles west to the islands in the South Pacific. Obed Hendricks' boat was carrying William Bond, Lawson Thomas, Charles Shorter, Isaiah Shepard, and Joseph West. They ran out of food on January 14th. Captain Pollard offered to share his remaining provisions with the ship. Captain Pollard's boat carried Samuel Reed, Owen Coffin, who was his younger cousin, Barzilla Ray, and Charles Ramsdale. After sharing their food with the other boat, the food supplies ran out on January 21st. Lawson Thomas died first on January 20th. With just 1 day of food rations left, the men decided to store the body. Charles Shorter died January 23rd. Isaiah Shepard died January 27th. and Samuel Reed died January 28th. On January 28th, the two boats separated. Obed Hendricks's boat was never seen again. The three remaining men are presumed to have died at sea, but it is unknown what horrible events unfolded on board their tiny boat. But undeniably, it is safe to say that the men suffered greatly. A whaleboat later washed upon Douchy Island, with skeletons of 3 people on board. It is suspected that this is the remains of Hendricks, Bond, and West, but the remains have never been positively identified. February 1st, on Captain Pollard's boat, the food the men had been surviving on, provided by their fellow sailors, was all gone. Their situation was desperate. The sailors had a conversation, and it was decided the men would all draw lots to determine who would be sacrificed for the survival of the rest of the sailors. They cut paper, and one had a black spot to determine the one to be sacrificed. The men drew the lot, and the young Owen Coffin, Captain Pollard's now 18-year-old cousin, who Captain Pollard had sworn to protect, drew the black spot. It is alleged that Pollard offered to protect his cousin, offering to shoot any man that would go near him, but the young man replied, "No, I like my lot as well as any other." Another lot was drawn to determine who the executioner would be. His young friend Charles Ramsdale drew the black spot. He said, "No, I can't do it, I can't." Coffin replied. The lots had been drawn fair. They both accepted their fates, and Charles Ramsdale shot his friend Owen Coffin. Ramsdale, Pollard, and Ray all consumed the body. On February 11th, Ray also dies. For the remainder of their journey, Pollard and Ramsdale survived on bone marrow. By February 15th, the 3 survivors on Chase's boat ran out of food. On February 18th, a long 89-day journey after the whale had destroyed and sunk the Essex, a British ship, the Indian, was sailing off the coast of Chile and spotted the tiny boat in the vast ocean. Chase, Lawrence, and Nickerson were rescued at last. The whaleboat was towed behind the Indian. A few days later, it was lost in a storm. 93 days after the whale attack, Pollard and Ramsdale were almost in sight of Santa Maria Island when a Nantucket whaling ship, the Dauphine, spotted them. The large ship went right up beside the small whaleboat. Captain Pollard and Ramsdale were so completely out of it at this point that they didn't even notice the large ship right next to them. The men became terrified when they saw their rescuers. Commodore Charles Goodwin Ridgely wrote, "The men were found sucking the bones of their dead mates, which they were loath to part with." The men were most likely insane at this point. They were unaware of their rescuers at first, and most likely didn't even notice one another on board for the past few days, lost in a cloud of insanity. Despite the state of Captain Pollard, he recovered and eventually told the tale of his survival to the crew and pleaded for a ship to be sent to recover the men who were left on the deserted island. On March 5th, the Dauphine spotted the 2 brothers, which was sailing to Valparaiso, and handed over the 2 survivors. After the 2 had been in Valparaiso for a few days, the remaining men on the Indian were transferred to the USS Constellation and were put under the care of the ship's doctor. After officials were informed, the 3 survivors, Wright, Weeks, and Chappell, had been left on deserted Douchy Island, which in fact they were not actually on. They were on Henderson Island. The vessel Surrey was asked to look for them. The Surrey was already intending to sail across the Pacific Ocean, but even though they were looking for the wrong island, the Surrey succeeded in the rescue. Finally, on March 17th, Pollard and Ramsdale were reunited with Chase, Lawrence, and Nickerson. The last survivors were rescued on April 5th, 1821, and they learned 7 of their fellow sailors had been consumed by their 5 surviving crew members. All 8 of the survivors went to sea again. To return to Nantucket, Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, later speculated that all would have survived if they followed Captain Pollard's recommendation and sailed to Tahiti. Captain Pollard returned to sea in 1822 to captain the whale ship, the 2 Brothers. She wrecked on the French frigate Shoals in a storm off the west coast of Hawaii on her first voyage. He then joined a merchant vessel, which again was wrecked off the Hawaiian Islands. After all of this, Pollard was considered a Jonah, meaning unlucky, and no other ship owner would trust him to sail a ship again. He was forced into an early retirement He eventually became a night watchman in Nantucket. It is said that every November 20th, he would lock himself in his room and fast in memory of the men from the Essex. He passed away in Nantucket on January 7th, 1870 at the age of 78. First Mate Owen Chase returned to Nantucket June 11, 1821. He found out that he had a 14-month-old daughter that he had never met. For 4 months he wrote an account of the disaster, named The Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whale Ship Essex. Herman Melville used it as an inspiration for his novel, Moby Dick, in 1851. Chase went to sea again and sailed as first mate on the whale ship Florida. After that, as captain for the ship Winslow. He did that until he could afford to buy his own whaler, the Charles Carroll. He sailed for 19 years, returning home periodically every 2 or 3 years. Every time he returned, he fathered a new child. His first 2 wives died while he was at sea. He divorced his 3rd wife when he found out she had given birth 16 months after he had last seen her. In the end, he did bring up the child as if it was his own. In 1840, he married again for the 4th and final time and retired from whaling. He was haunted by memories of the harrowing ordeal being lost at sea. He suffered headaches and nightmares. He went insane later in life. He began hiding food in the attic of his house. He was institutionalized and died in Nantucket on March 7, 1869 at the age of 73. Thomas Nickerson, the young cabin boy who was 14 at the beginning of the voyage aboard the Essex, became a captain in the mercantile service. Later in life, he wrote his own account of the sinking, titled The Loss of the Ship Essex, sunk by a whale and the ordeal of the crew in open boats. He waited 56 years before he wrote this account in 1876. It was lost until 1960. It was republished again in 1984. He died in February of 1883 at the age of 77. Little is known about the other surviving crew members. What we do know about them is Thomas Chappell died of plague fever in Timor while working as a missionary. William Wright was lost at sea in a hurricane in the West Indies. Charles Ramsdell died in Nantucket July 8, 1866 at the age of 62. Benjamin Lawrence died in Nantucket March 28, 1879 at the age of 80. Seth Weeks died in Barnstable County, Massachusetts on September 12, 1887. He was the last survivor of the Essex to die. Neither the community or the church condemned the men because of their cannibalism while lost at sea, but Owen Coffin's mother never forgave Captain Pollard, who promised to look after the young man. She had trusted him in his care. And that is the story of the sperm whale attack and sinking of the Essex, and the long ordeal the men faced fighting for survival, ultimately succumbing to cannibalism. The one thing they feared that forced them to take the longer journey. There were no cannibals on the island in the end, but the men became what they feared the most. And this is the story that gave the inspiration to Herman Melville to write the famous book, Moby Dick. Not as well known as other survival stories, but everybody's familiar with Moby Dick, I have to say. Everybody, even if you haven't read it, you still know the moral of the story. And a great story, and I hope you all enjoyed. And we will see you on the next. Peace.